Yesterday, we ended with the onset of the Great Recession, which is the economic downturn after the housing crash and financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And so clearly, the United States needed a change of direction, as poor economic times usually lead to changes in leadership. And Republicans have been in charge for 8 years, and so it was likely that the Democrats would have a good shot to take back the White House and both houses of Congress. So for the election of 2008, we have some groundbreaking new candidates. John McCain of Arizona was nominated as the Republican candidate, and Barack Obama, who is a senator from Illinois, was nominated as a Democratic candidate. Obama is noteworthy for a few obvious reasons. He's relatively young and African American, which set him apart from the last previous presidents, or all of the previous presidents. And so we go into the election of 2008 basically talking about changing the country's direction. How do we feel about the war on terror? How do we feel about, in general, the state of the economy and the direction the country had been going under George Bush? A couple things influenced the election, including one of the biggest pieces was the choice of running mates. At the time, it seemed a brilliant choice for John McCain to offset his old whiteness by picking a female vice presidential candidate. Unfortunately, Sarah Palin turned out to have less of a strong grasp on policy. You should definitely Google this Sarah Palin's interview with Katie Couric, where she basically broke down sort of collapsed in on herself, being after being asked a series of pointed policy questions. And you should definitely watch Tina Fey's portrayal of Sarah Palin on Saturday Night Live because it's apt and really defined how Americans viewed her. So some of it is about the strength of Obama as a candidate, who is a young, vibrant, inspiring speaker. And some of it was about McCain sort of representing the status quo and Sarah Palin representing a type of political incompetence that we rarely see. So, end result is here. So, obviously, the electoral vote was not particularly close, and nor was the popular vote. And so, here's your popular vote, 53 to 47%, until we get our first African American president, Barack Obama. He's noteworthy for a variety of, again, noteworthy because he's the first African American president, because he's relatively young, and because he brought a sort of vibrancy and energy to the White House that we hadn't necessarily seen at the end of the Bush years. And so there was a lot of optimism about Obama's term, although it also stoked a lot of resentment from a lot of parts of society, and especially Republicans from the very beginning set themselves to stymie Obama's legacy. And part of this is, of course, about policy differences. But Mitch McConnell famously said when Obama was elected that the number one goal of Republicans should be to deny Obama a second term. And so, despite the fact that in the first couple of years, the Obama administration, because of Democratic majorities in the House and Senate, are going to get some things done. After the midterm elections in 2010, we're going to see a lot of stagnation and obstruction. So a couple things happened during Obama's term. Church and state is not about religion at all. It's the divide between the editorial side or the content side of news and the advertising side of news. So the idea that you should be producing content or producing news because it is important and interesting, not because you think it will sell. And so, as the internet put increasing pressure on media companies, what you start to see is a massive partisan divide. So there's very few or most media companies that are successful have started to move out to the fringes to try to find their own niche and find an audience that will follow them. So we see the partisanship or the polarization of news, which of course absolutely shifts and changes people's worldview. And so what you start to see, it happened during the Bush years, of course, but especially accelerated under Obama, is if you were watching MSNBC or watching Fox News, the coverage of an event would be absolutely different, right? And so if you're watching MSNBC, the Obama administration is effectively solving problems and pursuing solutions. If you're watching Fox News, we're literally on the verge of a breakdown. The society is falling apart as it seems, and you need to 100% embrace, you should be opposing all of these things that the Democrats are doing. So we start to create separate media landscapes, which really stymies our ability to talk across party lines and really even have communication between the two sides, because people are living in their different bubbles and basically different worlds. And so, although social media will accelerate this phenomena in the 2010s, it started in the 2000s. We started to see a significant divide between these two sides. So, for example, Fox News is here pointing out that MSNBC is a partisan news agency, which, I mean, pot calling kettle black, because you have, a guy named Glenn Beck, who used to be a regular on Fox News, constantly comparing Obama to Hitler. Which, yeah, I don't think, if you look closely at the actions of the Obama administration and Adolf Hitler's Nazi party in Germany, I don't think you could find as many parallels as Glenn Beck was constantly claiming that there were. So, and of course, we have this public perception, the idea of, we start to create this idea of the quote mainstream media, all of, these sort of news outlets skewing to the left. And because of that, Fox News skews more to the right, claiming that they're the only ones who are telling you the real story, because of course CNN is putting their, anti-Republican spin on all of the news. So, yep, nothing new under the sun here. We also get, with Obama elected, the rise of the Tea Party. The Tea Party is an acronym for Taxed Enough Already, which basically opposes the growth of government and new taxes. It was a conservative sort of grassroots organization opposing pretty much all of the Obama agenda. And they, of course, have since switched their allegiance to Trump at this point. They started as sort of a small government, fiscally responsible theoretical group, and now they're something else, I think. It's complicated. Obama's legacy, of course, his lasting, enduring legacy, is the Affordable Care Act, which became known as Obamacare, first pejoratively and now just colloquially. And so the Affordable Care Act is a variety of different things, and most of the people attacking it really don't understand exactly what it does. And so I'm not going to go through the entire piece of the Affordable Care Act. I'm just going to hit on some of the most important pieces. The Affordable Care Act is not a socialist takeover of healthcare or medicine. It does a couple things. One, it creates consumer protection specifically for pre-existing conditions, where insurance companies used to be able to deny people coverage because of health conditions that they had, and they used to be able to terminate people's coverage if they got sick, which of course, you clearly need insurance if you get sick or develop a chronic condition. So the Affordable Care Act prevented insurance companies from doing that. It's currently one of the most popular pieces of the law. And what you see is that even Republicans who are talking about repealing Obamacare talk about keeping the coverage for pre-existing conditions. It also set a minimum standard for care, including trying to make preventative care free, and also keeping prescription costs low, and to try to set this sort of minimum bar that all healthcare plans must have these specific things in them. And the last piece is it increased people's access to healthcare by creating these online marketplaces that people could use, shop for, and compare health plans, and then sign up through these online marketplaces. So those are the basic components of Obamacare. Oh, it also allowed young people to stay on their parents' insurance longer. Most people are still in favor of that. And of course, ensuring contraceptive services for women was another piece of it that is actually still somewhat controversial. So that's the Affordable Care Act in its final compromised form. And from the beginning, it was attacked and maligned to the point where, for a lot of people, even the word Obamacare makes them frothing at the mouth and clawing at people around them. So that's the basics of the Affordable Care Act. A couple things were problematic. One, obviously, Obamacare is expensive. I mean, there's no bones about it. If you're going to provide healthcare, it's going to be expensive. Anyone who says they're going to provide much better healthcare much more cheaply is probably lying to you, because it turns out if you want nice things, you have to pay for them. And so Obamacare was expensive. And one of the least popular pieces of it was something called the individual mandate, which said that every person has to get health care, has to sign up for some kind of health care plan, or else they're going to have to pay a penalty, a tax, a fine. Exactly what this punishment was somewhat controversial, and they're still fighting in the court about whether or not this is a tax. Because if it's a tax, then theoretically they could strike down the law. And it's complicated and arcane. You don't need to get into it. So, the individual mandate, problematic. The rollout of the website, problematic. Anytime you're rolling out a massive website that millions of people are going to access, there are going to be problems, and there were 100% problems. And the Health Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, got a lot of the flack for that, but Obama took a lot of flack too. So that was a problem. And the biggest problem for Obama was that he had made a statement that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor when he was promoting this law, which was a misleading claim because some doctors are going to be out of network for you if you change healthcare plans, right? And so you might not be able to keep your doctor. And he said if you like your healthcare plan, you can keep your healthcare plan. What he was trying to say there was that most plans, most private healthcare plans continue under Obamacare. It was not eliminating private health insurance, but it was a misleading claim or an untrue claim because some plans did not meet the minimum level of coverage that the Affordable Care Act demanded, and therefore were discontinued. And so Obama was then pilloried with these two statements for the rest of his term, arguing that he misled Americans about what Obamacare was going to be because they could not necessarily keep their doctor or keep their health plan. The rest of Obama's term was basically spent fighting about Obamacare. Republicans took back control, or sorry, we had divided government with Republicans taking back control of the House of Representatives in 2010, which led to basically divided government and very little progress until the election of 2012, which was sort of a referendum on a series of Obama's policies. Obama, of course, still running as the Democratic nominee. He was challenged by Mitt Romney, who was the former governor of Massachusetts. And Romney ran sort of on a plan to repeal and replace Obamacare, which was really problematic for him because he had passed something as governor of Massachusetts that was basically identical to Obamacare. So he got slammed for that. And Romney also got slammed for his massive wealth. He was secretly recorded at a donor meeting saying that 47% of Americans who don't have to pay into federal income tax, that he was never going to get their vote, and this was painted as Romney being, a wealthy, callous, out of touch billionaire. So that hurt Romney, and honestly, his faith hurt Romney because Mitt Romney is a member of the LDS Church, and so he did not emphasize sort of his religious values and his personal faith, which really hurt him with evangelicals. And so whether or not talking about his LDS faith would have converted or got evangelicals on his side is still up in the air. But clearly, he did not inspire the religious base the way that you think, the Republicans would hope to, with the sort of polar alliance between the religious conservatives and the political conservatives. So here's your end result. Not a close election. Obama gets elected by a relatively wide margin, and so we have a second term of Barack Obama. A couple things really influenced this election. One was the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Committee. This was a Supreme Court case that struck down limits on campaign donorship and opened up the use of these things called PACs, or political action committees. Political action committees are organizations that try to get candidates elected, and Citizens United basically said that they can raise unlimited money from whoever they want without having to disclose where it came from. And so the floodgates open, and any sort of limits or most limits on campaign finance are struck down, and the amount of money starts to flow into politics. And so the amount of political advertising we see increases significantly. And of course, critics of Citizens United would argue that this leads to lobbyists getting undue influence. So society becomes much more polarized during this time period, mostly because I would argue, for a lot of reasons, but the rise of social media is 100% going to polarize society. So whereas the news media helped polarize society, now social media also polarizes society. Democrats are becoming more liberal, Republicans are becoming more conservative, and the middle ground is starting to vanish. Cooperation between members of Congress of different parties has been moving away for a while, but we've reached sort of new lows in the Bush, Obama, and then Trump era, where simply you don't see much bipartisan legislation where both Republicans and Democrats sponsor it being proposed. And simply voting against your party's sort of line on any issue is enough to get you potentially pilloried and thrown out of the party. And so that's somewhat unfortunate because, of course, it limits cooperation. and the party discipline in both parties is incredibly strong. So Republicans or Democrats, even if they don't fully agree with their entire legislative agenda, they have to toe the line, or else they are cast out into the wilderness. So problematic. Another thing that really polarized society is the Great Recession. The effects of the Great Recession are still being felt. There's a real sense that although GDP picked up, employment and wages stagnated throughout most of the 2010s. In the end, after most recessions, we end up getting massive economic growth and employment. But after the Great Recession, what you didn't see that. And you didn't see that for a variety of different reasons. Employment did not rebound to the same extent it had before for a variety of different reasons. One is because, well, and also the other thing you saw was that the gains of wealthy Americans after the Great Recession were significantly higher than the gains of non wealthy Americans. Uh, I guess before I talk about Occupy Wall Street, I'll talk about the reasons why we saw a jobless recovery. There are really two reasons. One of the factors is an increasing amount of offshoring and jobs moving overseas. So some of it is that, and some of it is automation, where in the aftermath of the Great Recession, if companies had a choice between buying new equipment or hiring more people, they would, in general, buy new equipment, automate jobs that used to be done by individuals, which of course makes the company more efficient and increases the wealth of the shareholders and things like that. But of course, you lose a lot of manufacturing jobs. So in the United States, despite the fact that we make more in the United States today than we've ever made, the amount of people working those jobs is significantly decreased. So this leads, of course, to a lot of pressure on the vulnerable people who are on the bottom of the income spectrum. And we got this Occupy Wall Street movement, which was a completely unfocused movement in which people were, I guess, just going to sit outside of Wall Street until people did something. Uh, yeah. So it turns out sitting outside Wall Street until income is distributed more equally doesn't work. And this movement, despite the massive press that it got, fizzled out, and people decided to go back home and not occupy Wall Street anymore. Anyway, but it's the beginning of sort of the progressive populism that we see today amongst especially Bernie Sanders supporters. So here we see percentage of workers being offshored, and what you're starting to see, especially with the rise of high-speed internet, is it's not just manufacturing jobs that are going overseas. We're starting to see white-collar jobs going overseas, and this becomes incredibly problematic for the people who had those white-collar jobs, just like deindustrialization was incredibly problematic for the people who had those blue-collar jobs. And so the type of work that's happening is changing, and different groups of people are losing their jobs, which leads to, of course, outrage. Here's the risk of automation in the future, and this is going to be something that, man, we're going to have to deal with because obviously, as computers and software and AI become more sophisticated, the way that people work is going to profoundly change. So, yeah, man, when self-driving cars happen, something's going to have to give because, like, you think of how many people are employed just driving things from one place to another, and at some point that's not going to be a thing anymore. So yeah, craziness. We also start to see gerrymandering leading to a more polarized society. Um, I'll just put the map of Ohio on there. Partisan gerrymandering is redrawing districts to give one side a political advantage. You're able to do this every census year, which is why 2020 is such an important year. But after the 2010 election, the Republican National Committee focused on winning state legislatures and then using those state legislatures to redraw legislative districts to ensure that Republicans would have majorities in both those state legislatures and then would be able to send more representatives to Congress. You do it by dividing up groups of Democrats into small enough pieces to ensure that there's a Republican majority in districts, and by making districts that are almost 100% Democratic, so that although there might have been enough Democrats in a city to give them, 3 out of 5 seats. Actually, I have a slide in here that shows how that works. Anyway, you can Google a picture and see how it works. But you basically take, so if there are 5 seats, Democrats should get 3 out of those 5 based on the general demographics. Instead, you pack almost all the Democrats into one district and then split the rest up into the other 4. So instead of a 3-2 split, it would be a 4-1 split in favor of Republicans. And implying that, sorry, it's not fair to imply that Republicans were the only ones who did this. Democrats did too. Republicans just quite frankly did it better. So both parties are doing this. You can start to see really weird districts. This is a misleading one, but it is a ridiculous political district in Chicago. And so partisan gerrymandering leads to more safe districts where there's not a competitive election and there's no incentive to compromise. Marriage rights changed pretty significantly during the Obama years because, of course, the Defense of Marriage Act, which Clinton signed back in the 90s, is deemed unconstitutional, legalizing gay marriage across the country and becoming a cultural flashpoint between people who believe that gay marriage should be legal and people who do not. So, still fighting that, and the courts are still legislating exactly what that means, and we'll get more into that tomorrow. So, before the act, of course, these states had either legalized or were legalizing gay marriage, and of course, states including Kansas had it written into the state constitution that gay people could not get married, which then the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. So, gone. And of course, this is going to fire up especially religious conservatives. And so we continue to see an increasing uptake in specifically politically active evangelicals fighting for religious issues and religious freedom, in their words. So one of the other issues that polarized the United States, and honestly, this has mostly gone away at this point, is the accusations of the NSA spying on people. The NSA, or the National Security Administration, uh, had been given broad powers under the Patriot Act, but we didn't really understand how broad until Edward Snowden revealed to us the scope of what the NSA could actually do, which was, basically have used backdoors to get into most computers, operating systems, phones, things like that, if they really needed to. And that they were collecting massive amounts of metadata on Americans, and this was shocking to us. Exactly the scope that the National Security Agency had, or the ability that they had to surveil Americans. And so it shocked us for a while that the government basically, we had given the government all the tools to set up a totalitarian police state if they wanted to. And then we got distracted by something shiny. And now we don't talk about it so much anymore. So that's cool. And racial inequality really starts to grow, or sorry, the focus on racial inequality really starts to grow, because to argue that racial inequality happened in the 2000s is, of course, is contrary to most of the scope of this course so far. What we see is the rise of a group called Black Lives Matter, who's advocating for greater scrutiny of police officers and greater accountability for police officers. This happened because of a number of high-profile shootings of unarmed African American men, and this is a cultural flashpoint between groups that that argue that the police are indiscriminately killing African Americans, and groups that argue to support police officers. And so this becomes this massive issue that focuses again on the fact that there are still massive racial divides in this country, and we don't really know effectively how to deal with these things. So, Black Lives Matter movement, still active, raising awareness and trying to highlight these problems, and other groups not necessarily supporting that. For foreign policy, we get something called the Obama Doctrine, which is an attempt to try to sort of rebuild global consensus in the years after the Bush Doctrine. So, what we start seeing is the US entering into multi party treaties and trade agreements with other people. For example, the Iran nuclear deal, which this is, of course, Obama propaganda for the nuclear deal, but the Iran nuclear deal was an attempt by a number of Western countries to try to get Iran to abandon their nuclear program, and it became incredibly controversial because Republicans thought it was not strong enough. So Donald Trump has withdrawn the United States from the nuclear deal, saying that he would later negotiate a better deal, although that has not happened, and basically everyone has now forgotten about it. So cool. And Obama also tried to create a sort of a Pacific NAFTA in something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump then withdrew from, saying that he would negotiate a better deal with each one of the countries. And then, of course, that has not at all happened. So good times. The other, and then The other thing that Obama did that was somewhat controversial and problematic was he supported the Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East. The Arab Spring uprisings were a series of pro democracy uprisings that toppled a number of different military dictators. And we had hoped, or Obama had hoped, that this would lead to a new flowering of democracy in the Middle East. But instead, it led to, in Egypt, another authoritarian military ruler. In Libya, it led to chaos and civil war. And Obama's withdrawal from Iraq led to the creation of ISIS. And probably the most controversial piece of this was the attack on the American embassy in Benghazi, which was used as a political club to attack Hillary Clinton, where militants seized the embassy and killed our ambassador there. And that was, Republicans still argued that that was Hillary Clinton's fault because she was the Secretary of State when it happened. And she should have built bigger walls around all of our embassies and put more guns everywhere, I guess. I don't know. So, probably the worst thing, of course, was with the withdrawal from Iraq and the rise of ISIS, which is a terrifying millennialist Islamist group, which gained power in Syria and Iraq because of the civil war in Syria and the long-standing sectarian problems in Iraq. And so that's somewhat problematic. So Obama's foreign policy, a mixed bag to probably somewhat negative. Um, the basic criticism of Obama's foreign policy is that he was probably too naive in dealing with other countries, too idealistic, and didn't draw a strong enough line. For example, saying that if Bashar al-Assad of Syria used chemical weapons, that the U.S. would intervene, and then Assad used chemical weapons, and then we didn't intervene. So anyway, somewhat inconsistent. So I mean, you guys lived through a significant portion of the Obama presidency. How you view Obama is really a microcosm of your political beliefs. Do you think the Affordable Care Act was a good idea? Well, that depends on your political beliefs. Do you think Obama successfully managed all the difficult issues of polarization? Well, again, your political beliefs play into a huge role of that. So, 10,000-foot overview of the Obama administration. And tomorrow we'll try to finish it up by trying to make sense of whatever the heck is happening now. So, thanks for staying with me to this point. One more day, and then we're done.